Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the University of Glasgow and to the Bute Hall. It is wonderful to see so many people out this evening. My name is Anne Anderson. I'm Vice Principal and Head of the College of Social Sciences here at the University, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the University for this evening's very special lecture. This evening we are filming the event and we take your presence here as consent. If you have any particular problems with being filmed, perhaps you could move to the sides. This evening's lecture is sponsored by both the Stevenson Trust and Policy Scotland. I know that many of you here are stalwart supporters of the Stevenson Trust events, but some of you may not know its distinguished tradition and pedigree. It was, of course, established by Sir Daniel Macaulay Stevenson, who was one of those individuals from the 19th century that just makes you feel slightly inadequate. He had so many accomplishments and strings to his bow. He was an engineer, politician and philanthropist. He was a Glasgow councillor, and in the years leading up to the First World War, he was Lord Provost of the city, and he was Chancellor of the University, a post he held for 10 years from 1934 to shortly before his death in 1944. He was an incredible lifelong supporter of education in its widest sense and its benefits to the citizens of Glasgow. So he promoted Sunday openings of art galleries and museums and the introduction of a free library service. And he was a tremendous supporter of the University of Glasgow. He had a wide range of interests, and his interests spread across many disciplines. So he gave money to the university to expand engineering. He funded chairs in Spanish and Italian, and in 1921 he bequeathed funds to the university, now the Stevenson Trust, to support a lectureship and lectures in citizenship. Since 2006, the Trust has promoted a series of annual lectures on citizenship themes, and in keeping with Stevenson's own interests, these have ranged widely, addressing issues of citizenship from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives. This evening's event is co-sponsored by Policy Scotland, and this is the latest in Policy Scotland's successful events on Brexit. We've previously heard from some wonderful and high-profile speakers, including former EU Ambassador Lord Kerr, and only last Friday from the Chair of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, David McAllister, MEP. There are a number of further high-profile events around the theme of Brexit that we are planning, as the university reaffirms its position as the leading venue, not just in Scotland, but in the UK, for important discussion and for leading thinkers to share their views on what is clearly the defining issue in UK politics today. Tonight's lecture comes, of course, just after we learn that the Prime Minister will trigger Article 50 next Wednesday, and so it couldn't be more timely. For those who are on Twitter, we'll be using the hashtag #UOGBrexit for tonight's event. This evening's lecture has proved so popular, we've had to move to the largest venue in the University of Glasgow, and indeed, as you've heard, we are oversubscribed. And of course, that's because the topic is incredibly timely and important, but it's also a tribute to the distinction of this evening's speaker, Professor Anton Muscatelli, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Glasgow. Previously, Anton was Principal and Vice-Chancellor of Heriot-Watt, and he is a leading economist and, most importantly, a Glasgow graduate. His research interests are monetary economics, central bank independence, fiscal policy, international finance, and macroeconomics. He serves on many boards, including the Scottish Funding Council, which provides funding and oversight to Scotland's colleges and universities, and the National Centre for Universities and Business. He chairs the Commission on Economic Growth for the Glasgow City region. He has previously chaired the Research and Commercialisation Committee of Universities Scotland and was convener of Universities Scotland and Vice President of Universities UK. He was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2001, and in 2009 he was appointed Knight Commander of the Republic of Italy for services to economics and higher education. In 2012, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from McGill University in Canada. He is a distinguished academic in his own right and has published many important works, including impressively 4 books and over 60 articles in leading economic journals. Most importantly, however, for this evening's topic, in June 2016, following the vote in the UK-EU referendum, Anton was appointed as an individual by the First Minister of Scotland to chair the Standing Council on Europe, an advisory group to advise ministers on how best to protect Scotland's relationship with the EU. There is no one more qualified to give tonight's lecture, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing his views on Brexit and the future for the UK and the Scottish economy. Professor Anton Muscatelli.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming in such numbers tonight. I have to say this is the first time I've lectured in the Bute Hall, especially in this configuration. It works rather well, although it's rather scary to see so many screens. I'm very grateful to the Stevenson Lectureship Committee and to Policy Scotland for the kind invitation to give this lecture. Brexit, the decision, the consequences and the processes surrounding it, including the legal and constitutional controversies involved, is an absolutely massive topic and more than can be covered in a single lecture. It's an issue that's dominated European politics and beyond for the last year or two, and which will not disappear off our radar screen for many years to come. The implications of Brexit are absolutely profound for Scotland, for the UK, but I think also for the future of the European Union 60 years after the Treaty of Rome was signed, particularly in a geopolitical context where instability in Europe has wider repercussions. And the Brexit negotiations have to be understood in that context. You cannot divorce them from the geopolitical context. In the interest of full disclosure, for those of you who don't know me, I think I should explain what my perspective is on Brexit and my approach to this lecture, because I don't approach it from a neutral perspective, and I think that's quite important to disclose that. My academic area of expertise, as you've heard, is economics. I've acted as a policy advisor. I should add that I'm certainly not, as will become apparent, a legal or a constitutional expert, and indeed my lecture will inevitably focus on economic issues and perspectives, although obviously I'll have to mention issues in which I'm less of an expert. Anne very kindly mentioned about my chairing the Standing Council on Europe. We're a group of independent experts covering a range of expertise, and later I'll say a bit more about the Standing Council's work. I've also never been politically aligned throughout my adult life. I have provided advice to both UK and Scottish Parliament, and over many years to UK and Scottish governments of all political persuasions. And my approach has always been one of trying to provide expertise and advice as a public service. As many of you know, on the issue of the EU referendum, I think untypically I did express very strong views in favour of the UK remaining in the EU. And these views were driven both by a personal conviction, as you will hear later, that leaving is an economic disaster for both the UK and Scotland. I also felt that Brexit undermines the very important values captured within that Treaty of Rome I mentioned, and indeed, before the Treaty of Rome, the European coal and steel community. The European Union was, and I think still is, about ensuring peace in Europe through maintaining close economic ties between our nations. And that's something that Brexit potentially threatens. Also, let me say at the outset, as someone who is born in another EU country, I'm a dual UK-Italian citizen, I understand the feelings of many of my EU colleagues here at the University of Glasgow. For us, the vote to leave, but more importantly, some of the negative rhetoric around it did have a negative impact on all of us. And we're fortunate indeed that in Scotland, in part due to the 62% vote in favour of remaining, but also because of the rather different political rhetoric from all sides, that this negativity is less evident. So now that you understand where I'm coming from, this is the outline of the lecture. I'm going to look at the potential economic impact on the UK and Scotland of Brexit. Then I'm going to look at the UK and Scottish government's policy responses and strategies for dealing with Brexit. As you know, Brexit has been the catalyst for a major constitutional debate, and I think this is inevitable, given that Brexit will imply the repatriation of major powers from Brussels. I will conclude the lecture by just looking at some possible Brexit scenarios. So let me give you an introduction. What does Brexit mean? It's a very good question, actually, because the referendum of the 23rd of June sharply, of course, divided the UK. Although there were clear indications prior to the vote that the result was on a knife edge, I think there was still a real surprise in the early hours of the 24th of June when the results unfolded. Many, like me, who not only voted Remain, but sought to highlight the major economic costs of leaving the EU, were left to regret our inability to get that message across to the majority of UK voters. Indeed, I think the prospectuses for both sides in the campaign, Leave and Remain, were hopelessly confused in parts. To point out just one contradiction, which has certainly been central to the debate since the 24th of June, some on the Leave side, and including quite famously Daniel Hannan and Nigel Farage, were arguing actively that the Norwegian or European Economic Area model, outside of the EU but inside the European single market, was an entirely plausible outcome of a Leave vote. But some on the Remain side, to be fair, including the former Prime Minister himself, were arguing that Leave meant leaving the European single market, not only the EU. So it's not surprising that the picture 8 months after the referendum is still confused as to what Brexit actually meant or means beyond the range of epithets that have been attached to it. Soft, hard, red, white and blue, or indeed the rallying cry, Brexit means Brexit, which on a charitable interpretation is basically a promise not to retreat from the original vote. But I think there is a bit more clarity now compared to a few weeks ago, in the sense that the UK government published its white paper in January, setting out its objectives in the negotiation. That was preceded just before Christmas by the publication of the Scottish Government's white paper entitled Scotland's Place in Europe, which I'll talk a bit about. And the Welsh Government has also published its demands for the Brexit negotiation in a document called Securing Wales's Future. Now, Northern Ireland's position is, as you know, is complicated by the political crisis in Northern Ireland at the moment, and also the desire not to undermine the Good Friday agreements, which have brought peace to the province and which rely on the avoidance of a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and the North. As we'll see later, I think there are three broad scenarios for Brexit, and overlaid on that, there is a set of possibilities for intra-UK arrangements, which are in part informed by the Scottish Government's position and that of others. So, the long-term economic impact on the UK, Scotland and the EU of Brexit. You saw that there were a large number of studies, and I'll show you a slide with some of them in a moment, which highlighted that Brexit could be quite costly, both to the UK and Scotland and other constituent parts of the UK. There are a number of channels where these costs arise, and also potential gains that those who favoured Brexit also pointed out. Let me just highlight some of them. Reducing trade reduces economic efficiency. That's one of the biggest costs. Some of that would come not through tariff barriers, but through so-called non-tariff barriers, which are about impediments to trade, which are nothing to do with tariffs, but might be to do with other ways in which trade is blocked by, for instance, regulation. And the basic reasons why barriers to trade, any type of barrier to trade, is bad for our economy is because if you export less, it impacts on your economic output. But barriers to imports are also potentially bad because you're pushing up prices for consumers. You're having to produce those goods perhaps yourself at a higher cost. The second reason why less trade is bad is that if your economy shrinks, it also has budgetary effects. You have less of a tax base if your economy shrinks, and you can spend less on public services. And I'll say a bit more of that in a moment. Third, and I'm going to stress this tonight because it's really important for Scotland particularly, if you have less inward migration to the UK, that reduces labour supply. And as we shall see, this is a particular issue for Scotland as well as other parts of the UK. A fourth channel through which we have an economic cost from Brexit is through less foreign direct investment. This is hugely important for the UK. There's about £1 trillion stock of foreign direct investment currently in the UK, which has come from other countries which use the UK as a base to export into the European Union. Half of that investment in the UK, half of that 1 trillion stock comes from other EU member states. There's also a dynamic effect, lower productivity growth, because if you have lower trade, it is generally assumed that this will have cause your productivity to grow slower because those sectors that are exposed to trade tend to have more rapid productivity growth. Those that argue that Brexit could have positive effects generally stress 2 points, and these are the last 2 bullet points here. One, less regulation. If you're not in the European Union, you don't have to adhere to European regulations, so you could have a more dynamic economy. As I'll explain later, the problems with this line of argument is that if you want to maintain a trade relationship with Europe, you have to minimize frictions, and that causes a conflict with this. And then there's a minority alternative view, and this was seen by a handful of economists during the Brexit debate, that actually Brexit could have a positive impact on our trade because it could allow us to costlessly reallocate our trade away from slow-growing European countries towards more dynamic, faster-growing non-European countries like Asia. Now, that, the argument goes, will increase the efficiency of the UK economy. Now, as I said, that's a minority view, and I'll explain why it's a minority view. This is a busy slide. I'm not going to go through the detail. A lot of studies were carried out before the referendum. Many of these you'll have seen in the press by a number of agencies going up to down. The OECD, the CBI, in collaboration with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, Oxford Economics, the famous Treasury studies, and then a couple of other, one more favourable to Brexit called Economists for Brexit, who produced the results showing that Brexit could be positive, and Open Europe, a group that was looking at one particular scenario. The 3 scenarios that most of them looked at, and not all of them looked at all 3 scenarios, hence some NAs in there. One is for a soft Brexit. This is where the UK would leave the EU, but would stay within the European single market, part of the European Economic Association, European Economic Area, and essentially through that would trade as freely as possible within the European single market. Now, the thing about that is that you would be inside the single market, like Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, but you would be outside the customs union. So you would still have some impediments to trade because there would still be some need to check goods as they pass across borders, rules of origins in the EU, and all that. The middle scenario is which is really one where, as you see, the UK government, as you'll see later, the UK government has fixed its objectives on, is this notion that you could have a free trade, a standalone free trade agreement with the EU. And this is the model, if you like, that Canada has currently in terms of its new trade deal with the EU. It's also similar to the sort of model that Switzerland has, although it's a bit more complex in Switzerland's case. The third scenario is one where the UK fails to reach an agreement, and this is known colloquially as a hard Brexit. And then you have another scenario called the WTO, or cliff edge scenario, which has been in the press quite a lot in recent weeks, which is around the possibility that you cannot reach a free trade agreement as you're leaving the EU, and therefore the UK would stand alone on its own 2 feet in the world, trading under World Trade Organization or WTO rules, and essentially would have to adhere to these rules, which, as I will see later, are actually a bit constraining in many respects. So each of these studies looked at potential losses. Some of them looked at some of the channels I mentioned. Some of them only looked at trade. Others looked at budget and trade. Others looking at productivity effects. And that's why you get different numbers. So occasionally when people say economists don't know what they're doing because they have lots of different numbers, well, it depends on what assumptions you make. All these studies tend to define generally that you would incur losses to GDP of roughly between 2 and 9.5% by 2030, except for the last 2 studies. This, and I'll mention this in a moment. To be clear, these are not economic forecasts, and this is really important. They're not saying that UK GDP is going to be lower in 2030 than it is now. They are evaluations of where UK GDP might be relative to where it would have been if Brexit hadn't happened. That's the counterfactual. And that is what these studies show. And generally, they find that between 2% loss and as close to a 10% loss in most of the studies, with a couple of exceptions. The exception is Economists for Brexit. And the reason why they have such a positive result is that they make an assumption in their model which no other models assumes. They basically don't believe a key tenet of economic evidence in the area of trade, i.e. that you tend to trade more with the countries that are closest to you geographically. So if you look at the evidence on trade flows, economic and econometric evidence on trade flows, you'll find that most countries tend to trade more, all other things being equal, i.e. relative incomes, relative prices, trade barriers, with the countries closest to them relative to countries far away. So for instance, the US will trade more with Canada than with Asia. We will trade more with Europe than we will trade with Asia or North America. And these effects are so-called gravity effects. And most economists believe these gravity effects are important because they're there in the data. They tell us that these patterns of trade persist. Now, what economists for Brexit find is that if we can costlessly reallocate and attach ourselves to these fast-growing Asian markets, then, of course, there isn't a problem. Your GDP will be higher. But the reason why it's not easy to do that is because of gravity effects. So unless you believe you can defy gravity, this result is likely to be a bit of an outlier. And I personally, again, believe that what the economic data has told us for the last decades is true, and that these studies are much more likely to tell us what the real effect of Brexit is. The other study, which I should mention, the Open Europe one, put a lot of emphasis on deregulation, which is another reason why they get a range which is slightly positive. So you may choose to believe the alternative picture of the world given to you by the handful of economists who, I think there was about 6 or 7 who believe in this positive result, but I personally think that the impact from immigration, less immigration, productivity, less trade, budget effects are actually likely to be quite negative. Let's drill into a couple of the assumptions and points made into the analysis. First, the importance of immigration for the UK economy. Employment has risen quite dramatically in the UK since the economic crisis in 2007-8, and domestic employment has risen quite a lot. And indeed, the UK has absorbed additional immigration. Unfortunately, during the debate on Brexit, the argument was that this immigration had depressed average incomes in the UK. Now, there's many studies on this which actually completely deny this evidence. The rise in EU immigration has been a very important source of labour supply. It has actually added to the skills in the UK across the skills spectrum. The concern during the campaign was that this EU immigration had lowered real wages. There's absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. There's many studies, but this shows you a graph from one of such study by Jonathan Wadsworth and co-authors at the LSE. And this plots various local areas, tries to look at what has happened to the percentage change to UK-born wages. So it's looking at whether immigrants have had a negative impact on the wages of locals, and looking at the rate of immigration in each of these local areas. And there's absolutely no correlation between the two. There's no impact of immigration on local wages, on local wages for local-born employees. There is a negative. Interesting, you'll see that actually there has been a fall in the wage of UK locals in these local areas, and that is the key, actually, of what Brexit was about. In many respects, since 2007-8, real wages have been depressed in the UK. It's got nothing to do with immigration. They've just been depressed because of the way in which national income has been shared between employment and profits. However, it's easy to blame immigrants in that sort of situation. But it's not. Immigration actually has allowed GDP to be higher than it would otherwise have been. There's just one study that finds some small wage losses for low-skilled employees, study by Nicol and Salaheen a couple of years ago. However, that did not divide up the population between EU migrants and UK locals. So it's not, this study is more accurate. The other channel I wanted to emphasize is the budgetary impact of Brexit, because again, I think this will be really important in years to come if we end up with a hard Brexit. These figures come from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. It comes from the autumn statement. It was published in around November last year. The results have not changed drastically in the March budget. If anything, those figures have changed slightly for 16-17, 17-18, but for the outer years, they stay very much as they are. And this is an attempt by the OBR to look at the fiscal effects of Brexit because of less immigration, because of less productivity growth. And you'll see, there's also some positive effects, by the way, just to be fair, because of lower interest rates, because if the economy is depressed, the Bank of England is going to have to keep lower interest rates, and other factors also playing, presumably mostly to do with welfare payments, also some positive effects. But in total, the impact is actually to increase borrowing as a result of Brexit. And the assumptions the OBR made is that the UK leaves the EU in April 2019, that as a result, export-imports trade will fall, that immigration will be tighter, and they're assuming that all the money that is saved from the EU budget gets reinvested, by the way. So remember that figure on the bus, on the red bus? That figure on the red bus is actually allowed for in these figures. It's not as much as on the figure on the red bus. That was a bit of an exaggeration. But about 13 billion a year net gets reinvested back in the UK economy. But despite all of that, there's still an increase in borrowing, i.e. there's a shortfall in taxation relative to spending. Having looked at the UK, let me look at Scotland, because I think Scotland is really important. It has a slightly different pattern in terms of its economic structure and population structure. As many of you are aware, for many years Scotland was worried about its population trends. Its population is now stabilized, it's growing again. A declining population obviously matters because the decline impacts on our ability here in Scotland to grow the economy. It's actually become much more important now, because as some of you know, in the Scotland Act 2016, the way in which the Barnett formula, the block grant adjustment works, is partly dependent on growing our tax base relative to the rest of the UK. In fact, the UK government were arguing during those negotiations around the fiscal framework that actually we should be exposed to some demographic risks as well, and that question is still open and may be revisited after 2021. If you're going to be subject to those risks to your tax base and to your demography, then it's really, really important that you're able to grow your demography. Otherwise, you're going to end up with severe costs. And as we can see, immigration from the EU, these are the figures, the raw figures. Many of them have come from the EU 8, so sort of 8 accession countries, although quite a healthy number also coming from the original 14 before the accession countries. Smaller number from the EU 2, that's Romania and Bulgaria, and indeed the Baltic states. I think a really interesting figure is what is happening to young people, because we worry about an aging society. What's significant here is the 115,000 non-UK EU nationals aged 16 and over, between the ages of 16 and 34, who've come to Scotland. They constitute now 4.5% of employment in Scotland. And a further 7,000 were unemployed, not a large number, searching work, and 29,000 inactive, many of them family members of course, 115,000 who are here working. And that's, I think, a very significant number. From wearing my university hat, I know that many of these people come here as students and then stay and settle and actually make a significant impact. What is really interesting is that their employment rate is higher than that for UK nationals. So many of them, more of them, are in employment. And you remember again some of the debates during the referendum, people are coming here, not working, claiming welfare. The statistics actually belie that. And it's even for this case where age 35-49, statistics are slightly smaller, but the employment rates for EU nationals tend to be much, much higher. So now let me tell you a bit about the potential impact. You've seen some of those results in the big spreadsheet there for the UK as a whole. And you can actually do some of this work for Scotland as well. This is work that's been done by the Scottish Government, and Gary Gillespie from the Scottish Government is here. Some of this work has been done to inform the work of the Standing Council. What this work does is, and this particular slide does, is to show using a model which has been developed by the Scottish Government in connection with the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, what the potential impact is of a cliff-edge Brexit. And I'm going to focus a bit on cliff-edge Brexit because, as I'll say later, I think it's a real possibility. It's based on the National Institute model, and you saw some of the results of the National Institute model a moment ago. And you'll see what this model predicts, this Scottish Government version of the National Institute Global Econometric Model, in terms of impact on GDP, consumption, household investment, business investment, and net trade. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty drastic. It's 9.4% reduction in UK GDP. The effects for Scotland are slightly smaller. That's partly because for Scotland, we're slightly less exposed to EU trade than the rest of the UK. That's why that 8.5 is smaller, the minus 8.5 is smaller than minus 9.4. If you compare this to some other studies which have been done for the UK, you see that this, again, is a higher number, similar to the Treasury number, but this includes all the various effects that we were discussing earlier to do with reduced trade, productivity losses from reduction in trade, reduction in foreign direct investment, and so on. Some of you may have seen this study here, which is that wasn't on the sheet before. It's the Fraser-Valander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. Some of you will know from reading the press that they did a study for the European External Relations Committee of Holyrood. Their results are using a slightly different model called a CGE model, so-called computable general equilibrium model. I won't go into the details, but essentially it's a very different kind of model than the other ones using NIGEM. One of the things that I think the Fraser-Valander model tends to ignore, apart from having these two gaps here, obviously, one of the other things which it doesn't do, because of the nature of the model, it's not a fault of the analysis, it's the nature of the model, it actually assumes that there's possibly some feedback benefit for Scotland in terms of employment as a result of the UK faring worse out of Brexit than Scotland. I don't actually think that's particularly realistic. I do think that these results are actually much more in line with what one might expect. The other point to make is that migration effects are particularly important, and as are productivity effects. This is a chart which shows you how that minus 8.5 actually sort of winds over the period from the shock to 2030. Now, one point to make is that the model has been run as if the shock happens in 2017. Now, of course, we haven't left the EU yet. If this doesn't actually transpire in 2017, but it starts in 2019, then you can just renumber these all the way up to 2032, and the pattern will be exactly the same. It doesn't actually matter which year you start the shock. The point is that the major effects are not only coming through less trade, the major effects are coming because of the orange bit, which is to do with migration, less migration into Scotland, less growth, and as a result, we lose out economically. And the big turquoise bit, which is loss of productivity. Less trade, less migration, less productivity growth, and so on. That's the sort of dynamic effect. And this model probably doesn't take into account all the barriers to trade. It will, of course, take account to some extent of non-tariff barriers, because that's how it's modeled. It's modeled as a reduction in trade, and some of that will be due to non-tariff barriers, and you've got to estimate how that's done. And Guy and his team will have made assumptions in line with what the literature says about the impact of non-tariff barriers. But it captures most of the other channels that we've highlighted. Now, I hear you say nothing has happened yet, so what are you going on about? The UK economy is still growing. The skies over England are clear. Indeed, economic growth in the UK has remained buoyant since the Brexit referendum. But that's because there are no barriers to trade yet. We haven't left the EU, and we have not left the single market. Where economists, I think, did get it very wrong, and blame economists, is in assuming that the effects of Brexit in 2019, between 2019 and these things will, as the earlier graph shows, will wind gradually up between 2019 for around 20 years or so. Where we got it wrong is in assuming that this would translate into an immediate fall in both consumer and investment spending. And the reason that some economists, including the Bank of England, thought that this might happen is because the thought was, well, if households and businesses know that there's bad times ahead, they'll actually anticipate some of that and they'll spend less now. Now, of course, that hasn't happened. Consumer confidence has actually held up. This graph shows you what's happened to quarter-on-quarter GDP growth. And since the referendum, it's actually gone back up to the sort of levels we've seen, not quite as healthy as 2014, but actually quite credible levels. Now, of course, a few things have happened. The world economy has been more resilient in 2016. So some of our performance is due to the fact that we're trading with our trading partners have done better. For the first time in a long time, actually, since the economic crisis, all of the EU economies have grown at the same time. So that's been part of the pool. Bank of England has kept interest rates low, of course, has done quantitative easing. That's also helped. But it is essentially a consumer story. And this graph tells you how much of a consumer story it is. This graph shows you how much pay has recovered in terms of nominal pay, total employee remuneration, and the red line shows you household spending. And what that shows you is that as pay has gone up during 2016, households have gone out and spent this money. And this is what has caused the resilience. However, investment has slumped. And this is possibly more of a forward-looking indicator. Since the referendum, investment has remained business investment has remained low. And of course, one of the issues that we're seeing inflation creeping up now is that real spending might be depressed because consumers will find that their spending power is being eroded. So some of those negative effects in anticipation of Brexit might happen. But even if it doesn't, even if the economy remains resilient, there's no escaping that once we actually leave, that's when the effects will actually happen. So, of course, this is not a one-way street. Brexit will also have important costs for the EU, not just for the UK and Scotland. It is not a one-way negotiations, as Boris Johnson often reminds us. Brexit, if it reduces trade with the EU, will hurt the EU economies as well. But the point, and this is a really important point, the UK matters less for the EU economy than vice versa. I really get slightly dispirited in this when data is distorted in this debate. Let me just quote you something that David Davis said in his evidence session today, exiting the EU Select Committee just last week. And I quote, "Never forget it is 290 billion from Europe to us, whereas it's 230 billion from us to them, so it's important for them. The problem is that 230 billion for our economy is a bigger number proportionally than 290 billion over 27 economies. It's basic arithmetic. And I really get annoyed when you start being confronted with statistics like that, which are distortions of the fact. This slide shows you roughly what the issue is. UK is a sizable source of demand for the EU27, but not huge. It's about 0.5, 0.6%. If the EU's exports to us fall by 10%, their GDP effect is 0.05%. For us, our exports are worth about 13% of our GDP. So if they fall by 10%, it's 1.3% of our GDP. That's the magnitude size. So let's not pretend, of course it's costly. I think actually if you're going to point out how expensive it is for the EU, I would focus more on these issues. These are more realistic issues, I think, to focus on if you're worried about what might happen to the EU. The EU is worried about some of the issues. They're worried about the complexity of supply chains. The UK businesses are much more upstream in supply chains for a number of sectors around Europe. And they're worried because some of the things we produce, some of them are services, also in sectors like engineering, mining and chemical products. The UK is in that supply chain. So if we end up in a bad Brexit, in a cliff edge, then these companies that have supply chains spread across Europe will actually be hurt by the fact that the UK will be outside. And that that does matter to the EU. Some countries in the EU care more, and I'll come back to that. And of course, I mentioned the FDI stock. Well, there's a lot of Dutch companies, etc., that have bases in the UK. They don't want that FDI value to be destroyed. Their other worry is no doubt that if the UK leaves the EU, it might actually undercut the EU on social regulation. It might go for a race to the bottom. Singapore and North Sea, all these other metaphors that have been used, essentially seeking to attract more jobs. That is a worry. Capital markets, and let me tell you one thing, in all the discussions I have, is that financial passporting, unless we stay within the European single market, is unlikely to be allowed. And I think the city in the UK, more people I speak to in the city, have given up on the alternatives to passporting. For a while, there was the hope that equivalence, so-called equivalence, and some arrangements that would allow our regulations to be equivalent, declared as equivalent to EU regulations, would allow us to carry on exporting in an unfettered way in terms of our financial services to Europe. It now appears that I think the city has given up on all of this unless we are in the single market. So that's another issue. So these are the sort of issues that the EU does worry about. And the worry is that if some non-EU investment banks leave London, they won't go to Europe, they'll actually go back to New York, and therefore this will affect the depth of capital markets in Europe. So let me come to the policy positions. I'll say a bit about the UK position in detail, as I'll tell you a bit about the Scottish Government's white paper. The Welsh Government, I won't be talking much about what they want to do, but let me just tell you, securing Wales's future is essentially about wanting full and unfettered access to the single market for goods, services, and capital. They also care about structural funds and social and environmental protections. And they do care particularly about some sectors like agricultural and food products. So that's the Welsh Government position. Northern Ireland, as I said, has experienced a political crisis, so there is no single government position there, of course, because there isn't a government at the moment. There's still a negotiation post the election. The key issue for Northern Ireland is, as I said, the maintenance of the Good Friday agreements. And let's not forget there's a lot of funding that has also gone on the back of those agreements. There's a Peace 4 flow of funds at the moment, which earmarks some 270 million euros until 2020. These are important structural interventions that have helped both sides of Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. I would suggest to you that, again, if you look at the performance of David Davis in the exiting the EU Select Committee, and if you like horror movies, it's a very good watch. He basically, when interrogated by Maria Caulfield MP, made it very clear there are no solutions yet to the problem of how one could avoid a customs border between the North and the rest of Ireland. That's quite clear in his answers. They're working on it, he said. They're looking at the trusted trader scheme. They're looking at the possibility of having more electronic systems to ensure they don't do the checks on the border. Of course, as I'll come back, if you have those sorts of systems, actually it could help what the Scottish Government is proposing as well. But I'll come back to that. This slide sets out the UK Government's white paper. A lot of you will be familiar with the plan. The 12-point plan. I won't go through all of the points. I will focus on the two in a moment. There are positive notes in there, and I think these are obviously attempts to try and get a good negotiation. Smooth transition and new arrangements, we'll come back to that. Cooperation in fighting crime and terrorism, one of the strong cards, if you hear people like Charles Grant, who also sits on the Standing Council, these are the strong cards that the UK has to play. These are the areas where our cooperation is valued by the EU. I'll talk a bit about the main issue, which is the main red lines, which have forced the UK to go down a particular hard Brexit route. The Great Repeal Bill, a bit of a misnomer. It's the Great Consolidation Bill, which is essentially bringing the whole body of EU law as it is at the moment of Brexit into the whole acquis communautaire into UK legislation, which means that there isn't a break point. But the real strategic issue, as you will see, is what happens after that. That's fine at time t equals 0. What happens after that? And that's the key issue. The real issue for the UK government, the reason why they decided not to go for European single market membership, is because they realized that the EU would not accept the political red lines that the UK government has set. Particularly, they want to control immigration, they want to take control on immigration, and that cuts across the freedom of movement, which the EU sees as an integral part of membership of the single market. And the other is moving outside the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. No foreign judges. No foreign judges, I was told, I didn't realize until recently, was a Swiss expression, but we seem to have adopted it. And this implied rejecting membership of the European single market. I think it's a pity, in my view. There's a very interesting lecture given at Edinburgh University by the president of the EFTA Court, Karl Baudenbacher, in which he pointed out some interesting facts, which I think commentators like myself and others thought might have offered some way out to the UK government's position that they don't want the Court of Justice of the European Union to be, if you like, to have this lead role in regulating the European single market. To be clear, the EU's position on this is actually quite consistent. If you have a single market, you have to have a single body controlling its regulation. And yet, the way in which this works for those countries that are not members of the EU but are part of EFTA, of the European Free Trade Association, and are part of the single market, Iceland, Norway, Liechtenstein, is that they have an equivalent pillar. They work with the EFTA court and the EFTA surveillance unit. And it acts almost like a proxy for the Court of Justice of the European Union. But these are the key points. The EFTA court doesn't have primacy. And I thought as a point of principle that would have been quite important to the UK government, because if the EFTA court rules, then there's no requirement, there's no immediate change in UK legislation. And there is a requirement for the EU, there would be a requirement as there is for the EFTA EEA countries to adapt, but there isn't an immediate requirement. There's no primacy. These effects only take place after the implementation of a legal act in the domestic legal order. There are no penalty payments resulting from infringement, unlike infringements within the EU of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the EFTA court is an independent court of law. It is not a supranational covering 27 countries. And I think one thing that has to be remembered, and this will play an important part in regulation, we would like a bilateral deal. If you read the white paper, it talks about some dispute resolution mechanism as yet undefined. It talks about what's in the Canada-Europe trade agreement. It talks about Switzerland to some extent. It talks about actually, I think, the New Zealand-Korea deal. It talks about some sort of dispute and arbitration mechanism. But actually, the EU Council has made it very clear they don't like the current arrangement that Switzerland has. Switzerland has about 120 treaties with the EU, and they are static treaties. They do not adapt as the body of law of the EU evolves. The EU doesn't like that, and as a result, they've actually pretty much told Switzerland that they would like them to adapt. And since 2008, they're saying to Switzerland, no more agreements, and they are urging the Swiss to move to the EEA arrangement. And indeed, the position at the moment is that you cannot have, of the EU, you cannot have access to the full unfettered access to the European single market unless you have some surveillance mechanism and some independent court. And that is, I think, the sticking point. Okay? So what the UK wants is some sui generis, bespoke type of relationship. It actually is quite ironic. I've actually heard that expression sui generis in a panel I was on from a representative of the UK government. And I thought it was quite interesting because actually it's exactly what the Scottish government is seeking through its white paper, is some attempt to find a solution which is bespoke. And as I say, Europe is generally looking for able to look at bespoke solutions, although this particular one is going in the wrong direction. I think a key issue for the UK as it develops this bespoke relationship, even if it manages to persuade the EU to shift from its current red lines, is that what will this bespoke model look like, and how will it adapt to the fact that EU regulation will continue to evolve over time? The key question is this: what is the UK's trade strategy? Are we still going to be orienting ourselves to Europe because of gravity effects? Because if we are, then having the Great Repeal Bill and freezing our incorporation of the acquis at one point in time doesn't help us, because EU regulations will begin to diverge. It'll make it more difficult for us to adapt, especially if this dispute resolution mechanism, so this dispute resolution mechanism, whatever it is, will actually struggle with that. So what is our EU strategy? I actually think there was a really good session with the European External Relations Committee by Sir David Edward recently at Holyrood. And I'll quote a couple of bits of his testimony because I think it's really important. If Europe remains our major market, and it's 45% of our market, and it's not going to decline a lot, and indeed, if we want to grow that relationship, we cannot deviate from EU legislation. I'll just quote one point which Sir David Edward made. I would put it like this, he said, "You might escape the direct jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, but you will not escape the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice." The Court of Justice case law is still there. And if we want to export to these markets, we can't ignore what they're doing. If EU regulations begin to evolve, what are we going to do? And look at what Switzerland does. Because in another session with the European External Relations Committee, Professor Oesch of the University of Zurich told the committee that while Switzerland and the EU had this bilateral relationship, actually what Switzerland has done over time, even despite the fact that it isn't a member of the EU or the EEA, it has autonomously adopted EU law into its own statutes since the late 80s. It's had to do that, otherwise it couldn't trade with the EU. He estimates that 30 to 50% of all the acts and ordinances at the federal level in Switzerland are influenced by EU law directly or indirectly. So this comes back to the regulation point I made earlier. If you want to just walk away from Europe, you can do so. But if you want to trade with Europe, you can't walk away. They're still there. The Court of Justice will be evolving its judgment. You'll have to adapt your regulations. If you don't, then you'll have to struggle to export markets which are not Europe. And of course, there's been also interesting examples given recently in the press about what happens if we reach a new free trade agreement with America, with the United States of America, which will have as one of its key propositions, no doubt, because the US is very keen to export in agricultural terms, and they find the EU a bit of a barrier because of its food standards. They'll want to export certain types of foods to the UK. And at the moment, they can't because the EU has taken quite a different line in maintaining certain standards. But if we give in, because we have a weak bargaining position, and we start importing chlorinated chicken carcasses or hormone-grown beef, and that's fine, we can do that. But if we want to, that goes into our food chain, that will have an impact on our ability to export into Europe. So there's a number of issues here which are really important. We can run away from Europe, but actually there's some real issues. The Swiss laws, as I say, shadow the EU. Sectoral deals are also a problem for the WTO. You've seen in the white paper, the UK is really keen to do a deal in certain sectors. There are rules in the WTO, Article 24 of the GATT, which prevents you from doing that. You cannot go for sectoral deals. If it's going to be a free trade agreement, it has to be comprehensive for it to pass the rules of the WTO. I'll mention the red lines. Let me come to the Standing Council. This is just setting out how the Standing Council works, what our function is. I won't really go into the details of this. Essentially, we have three principal functions, which is to provide expert advice on securing our relationship. We meet to consider the impact of any proposed changes to the UK's relationship to the EU on Scottish interests, and to advise Scottish ministers through negotiations in order to secure Scottish interests and objectives. We've tended to meet on a 6 to 8 week timetable in plenary. We've also had work streams up to now. An important point, which is, because occasionally I get asked, it must have been difficult for you to write Scotland's place in Europe, and I have to keep saying, we haven't written Scotland's place in Europe. It's very much a Scottish Government white paper, and that's a really important distinction. We are an advisory group. Clearly, we have provided advice at different points, but actually, the white paper is the government's policy position, and I think that's an important point. So let me tell you a bit about Scotland's place in Europe, because it's a really interesting. I think it's as John Kerr, who gave a Policy Scotland lecture, said, it's a technically really impressive document. It's trying to achieve something which is very, very difficult in a situation where Scotland hasn't chosen to leave the EU. But let me tell you a couple of points, because it's really important. Some of these points have been misunderstood in the press particularly. First, the key proposition is that its argument is that the whole of the UK should stay within the European single market. That's the best possible scenario. It's not, of course, what Scotland voted for. It's not what the Scottish government wants. It would like to stay in the EU, but it was prepared to compromise in this document in saying we're prepared to keep the whole of the EU in the European single market. And indeed, by the way, also the customs union. The argument was the UK should stay in the customs union. And both of these points, as we know from the UK White Paper, have not been accepted. Second, the proposition is that failing that, we should try and the UK should try and develop a differentiated solution with the EU which allows Scotland to remain within the European single market. Let me take the final point first, just to be absolutely clear, and I think this is very clear in the paper. The paper makes it very clear that this would need to be agreed by the UK as the member state. There was no proposition to the EU. This was very clearly put to the UK as a solution. The other point to make, and this is really important, it's a parallel market solution. I've read numerous times since the publication of this white paper the proposition that this is about putting barriers in the trade between Scotland and England and Wales, and that's nonsense. It's a parallel market solution. There would be no barriers in intra-UK movement of goods and services. The only issues would arise in terms of channeling goods from England, say, to Scotland, to the EU, or vice versa. Goods produced in Bristol, which were destined to Glasgow, solely to Glasgow, would not be totally unaffected by the solution that's proposed here. Goods produced in Edinburgh that would go to Cardiff would be totally unaffected. Scotland would have 1 foot within the existing UK commercial product markets and 1 foot within the European single market. Yes, it's a challenging solution because it relies on a lot of the issues that I was mentioning earlier with respect to Northern Ireland. How do you conduct checks without doing those at the border? But there are systems to do that. We know there exist systems for that within the EU at the moment. And indeed, the main issue, if there is an issue, is, and I was asked this point by the Holyrood Committee, Europe and External Relations Committee, is how do you make this work in terms of this differential system on goods if there is a divergence of product market regulations between Scotland and the rest of the UK? And there are two answers to that. It's not in Scotland's place in Europe, but I think there are structures that you can develop to do that. First, as we've seen, the UK will need in some way to shadow European single market. There's no way in which you could simply walk away from it. Scotland being part of the European single market may be a useful mechanism, I've used this expression, to tether part of the UK to the European single market. The second answer to this probably lies in imagining a UK Federal Competition and Markets Authority whose role is first of all to advise the UK Parliament to shadow EEA regulations, single market regulations, to ensure that UK legislation and regulations don't stray too far from the EU, and second, perhaps could act as a surveillance authority for a differentiated Scottish participation in the European single market. And third, perhaps act as a liaison with the EFTA Court or the Court of Justice of the European Union. And then you can begin to see perhaps a solution to how this would be adapted. There are other challenges in Scotland's place in Europe. They're to do with the fact that membership of the EFTA or EEA areas at the moment is restricted to nation states. Those treaties would need to be changed, but there's a lot of treaties that are having to be changed anyway as a result of Brexit. The other big area that SPY mentions is it's around the repatriation of competences. And there are a number of, it outlines a number of powers no longer subject to EU law, which would need to be repatriated to Scotland: agriculture, fisheries, education, health, justice, environmental protections. Repatriated competences in reserved areas where Scotland has expressed the view that it wants to do more to protect citizens' rights, so these might want to be devolved. It's a matter of negotiation. And then there's the issue that if you want to have a differentiated solution, there's a number of other areas where you would have to grant the Scottish Parliament additional powers. And indeed, I think an important point in all of this is that Brexit, and two colleagues at Glasgow have Noreen Burrows and Maria Fletcher have recently published an article in the Juridical Review, I think it's about to come out, which is entitled Brexit as a Constitutional Shock and its Threat to the Devolution Settlement. The point is this, and I think the Prime Minister actually made this point when she spoke on the 3rd of March in a speech. She recognised that I'm afraid the status quo is just likely to be threatened by Brexit, because immediately you have these issues that you have to confront. And there are issues in terms of how the market operates within the UK that you're going to have to confront. And Noreen and Maria actually in that paper highlight a number of areas where there is essentially, Brexit is going to cause some change in that area anyway. So it's hugely important. The other point to make about SPY is that there is variable geometry in Europe. Two colleagues in the Standing Council, David Martin, MEP, and Alan Smith, MEP, have produced a different diagram, a bit like this. It also has outermost regions and other parts of various dominions and overseas territories for the EU 28. And it shows you just how complicated the European map is. And it's not impossible to think that you might want to deploy some of this variable geometry. And this is one of the points that SPY makes. So, very quickly, because I realize that an hour has passed nearly since I started talking, let's look now quickly at the process. We know now when the trigger date is for Article 50. There's been a parliamentary debate. There's been real disappointment. I think certainly that the two Lord amendments were not accepted by the Commons. To echo what I think Keir Starmer said, I think it's, as an EU citizen perhaps, and many EU citizens feel the same, I think it was rather appalling that greater guarantees were not given to EU citizens. I think it would have been a costless thing to do. I think it would have set the right tone for the negotiations, but that's a personal view. I also certainly think that a greater scrutiny of the process, for the reasons that I'll discuss in a moment, would have been important. There's the issue of the content of the Article 50 letter. We don't know what that letter will say. I've certainly argued strongly with UK government officials that you should try and keep all the doors open if possible, including that of the single market. We'll see that a transitional arrangement might be really important. And the point I've made, and I'll make again, is that the UK bargaining position is weak, because we think this is a bargain over economic issues, and we're more exposed on economic issues. But actually, ultimately, some of the issues that the EU 27 care most about are not economic issues. And this is the real problem. So the EU's priorities and negotiations are rather different. Ultimately, the main priorities are around, they can't give the UK a better deal than EU membership. Then otherwise, why would anybody stay within the club? The four freedoms are inseparable. Now, some countries, Netherlands, Sweden, Greece, Finland, might think that there might be some wiggle room there, but actually all, apart from those, all actually would hold the line that the four freedoms are inseparable. The UK budget contribution is important, certainly up to 2020, because, and that comes to the divorce settlement, which I'll talk about in a moment. Countries like Greece, France, Germany, Austria, Poland, Portugal, Slovakia would find it very difficult to put their hands in their pocket and say, politically, to say, let's add to the budget because the UK is taking some money away for the budget running up to 2020. And on the trade deal, there's some EU countries, as I said, are more exposed. The divorce bill. This is certainly a political hot potato, if ever there was one. There are some costs attached to the UK leaving. Some of them, I think, most people would find pretty uncontroversial. There are pension liabilities. We've been part of this club. We've created employment. These employees have pensions. You need to pay for them. These liabilities have already been accrued, so arguably we should pay for them. There are however, some areas of dispute. How much of the budget post-2019 has already been committed? And certainly, I think about a third of the EU budget, which is around cohesion funds, has been committed. These things are decided 7 years at a time. Certainly, there are bits for negotiation, but if you're a Daily Mail reader, this bill, even if it's reduced, still looks impossibly large. And the difficulty is that the EU lead negotiator for the Commission, Michel Barnier, and many other member states have made it very, very clear that the divorce settlement comes first in any negotiation, and we talk about the future framework, the trade negotiation, afterwards. The UK wants to do it in parallel. I think where there's likely to be compromise is that there needs to be at least, in principle, agreement on this. If this doesn't go very far, then frankly, the future framework gets kicked into the long grass. And you need 18 months to reach a deal, because then the deal has to be approved by all the national parliaments, some of the regional parliaments, and of course, ultimately also has to go through, ratified by the European Parliament. So, coming to the scenarios. I think there are three possible scenarios here. First, a cliff edge Brexit, where we leave with no agreement. I think this is a realistic scenario, because with only 18 months to discuss a divorce deal and the beginnings of a future framework deal, after which member states, regional parliaments, etc., have to approve the deal, it's a long shot to achieve all of this. Most free trade agreements take 5 to 7 years to discuss and agree fully. And what worries me about the language of some UK ministers when they say no deal is better than a bad deal suggests that actually some of them are quite happy to countenance a cliff edge Brexit. That came out during the parliamentary debate. I actually think operating under WTO rules is very painful indeed. You're talking about tariffs of up to 30 to 40% on agricultural products. You're talking about tariffs on industrial products of around 10, 12, 20%. And that's really quite serious. And even if you were to reach a transitional no-tariff deal with the EU, which some people have suggested, and which is allowed under WTO rules, you could say, well, for 10 years, where we haven't got an agreement, but let's have a transitional agreement which allows no tariffs for 10 years. It doesn't solve the problem for services. And that's the bigger part of our exports. The second scenario I've called a Goldilocks Brexit. From the government's perspective, it's the UK government's idea of a Goldilocks Brexit, which would see a standalone free trade agreement and a new strategic partnership. But although better than a WTO cliff edge Brexit, it would still constitute a hard Brexit in economic terms, because as I said earlier, it's difficult to have a free trade agreement which really takes account of services. You should look at the Canada agreement if you don't believe me. I actually thought the Goldilocks metaphor was quite appropriate, since it involves a little girl wrecking the house of the 3 or is it the 27 bears and then running away. Well, there we are. But as I said earlier, actually, if this Brexit were to pass, there would need to be some agreement on a dispute resolution procedure and some way of tracking EU regulations post-Brexit. Like the Swiss, we would need to find some way of shadowing this. Hence, the differentiated solution, actually, as Scotland's place in Europe suggests, might actually be possible in all of this, because we're going to have to find a way of managing all this. The other option is the single market comes back into play. It's been ruled out, of course. It may come back into play, I suggested in a piece for the Daily Telegraph a few months ago, that it might come back as a transitional measure. I think it's difficult to see a complete policy reversal unless there's a political crisis in the UK, or as we're heading towards the cliff edge, a transitional deal based on the status quo is used. It's difficult to see the EU agreeing to a transitional deal. I think David McAllister said that when he came here, without the fourth freedom being accepted and a continuing role for the Court of Justice of the European Union. So that's a key thing. However, if we do accept an EEA-type agreement, then actually it would give us time to negotiate free trade agreements with third countries. That's the whole point. Not only that, but actually it would satisfy, of course, the demands of the Scottish Government in Scotland's place in Europe, and it might even allow us some possible differentiation on non-trade issues like immigration. Let me just pick up two additional points. I think I would echo what Charles Grant and others have said. There's a real need for the UK to try and set the right tone for these negotiations and to understand that economic imperatives are not at the top of the list for the majority of the EU partners. Second, I would absolutely emphasize the need potentially for a transitional deal, because if the discussion is going pear-shaped on the future framework, that's all we've got left. And third, I would really urge the UK government to take into account the very different economic needs, not only of the devolved nations, but indeed of the important regions of the economy like London. London has labour market needs. If ours are serious, theirs are serious squared, and that's a real issue. So, to conclude, I won't read the conclusions. I think they're apparent. I think there's some real problems here in terms of Brexit. It's a very risky process. A cliff edge is a real risk. I would continue to argue that, I hope in the Article 50 letter, the UK government allows itself maximum room for manoeuvre, because it's a danger if it doesn't. There needs to be a solution to the dispute resolution mechanism under anything but an EEA solution. And I do think still a bespoke solution is possible. I want to remind you that there are examples of international negotiations that don't always come down to rational bargains. I was reminded just a couple of nights ago, I was thinking back to the UK's own history. Some of you may or may not know much about the Bretton Woods negotiations, which took place in the 1940s during the Second World War. They culminated in a conference in Bretton Woods in the US in 1944 to decide the economic settlement that would actually, the shape of the world order that would happen after 1944. The UK was led by Lord Keynes, one of the most able economists of his time, put forward some very good arguments, many of them about economic rationality to the United States, who, despite being, of course, our great ally in World War II, ultimately imposed its own vision for the post-war world economic order. And there are some similar points here. You should look at some of the quotes from the Bretton Woods debate where, Britain couldn't see how this rational argument couldn't get through to America, who basically said, well, you know what? We've given a major political and military and resource commitment to the war effort. This is how it's going to be, guys. And this is between two allies. So let's not forget our own history. I think this makes the policy debate over the next 24 months really more important than ever. So in conclusion, where will we end up? As I've stressed, I think the effects of Brexit are very long-term. We won't see the impact right away. Some of the impact will be serious, but it will be drawn out over time. Unfortunately, as I've shown you, we will be outside the EU for some time before we see the full economic impact of our decision. And as I said, that's why I think it makes the policy debate over the next 24 months even more important and even more vital. I think I would urge you all here tonight, no matter where you stood on the debate, leave or remain, just don't take anything for granted. Don't take anything that I've said to you tonight as gospel, actually. But don't take those who reassure you and tell you that it'll all be fine as gospel either. Because I think our duty as citizens is to respect the democratic voice. Of course it is. But as many commentators have pointed out, democracy is a process, not an event. So please continue to question the decisions which are being taken over the next 2 years on your behalf in the Brexit negotiations, and please ensure that your voice continues to be heard. I think that is the key message. If I'm going to leave you with one key message, I think it's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a depressing but fascinating presentation. I think there's time for a few questions, but we would ask you to wait for the roving mics and perhaps briefly say your name or where you're from before you ask questions. Can I see where our students with the mics are?
Hi, Stephen Watson, mathematician from Glasgow, very interested in this topic, and that was an amazing overview for me of the issues ahead. I want to focus on the issue of not taking anything for granted. I read with some interest today an article by Professor Richard Murphy, Professor of International Political Economy from the University of London, who referred or spoke of the GERS figures in fairly disparaging ways. GERS figures play a critical role in some of the evaluations people make of the UK economy and also Scotland's economy. So he talked about the 7 bits of information and data that one needs to know. He listed them. I won't bore you with the detail. But then says that if one actually looks at the GERS report, he said the report is candid that the data is estimated. Indeed, 25 out of the 26 income figures are estimated, extrapolated from data from the UK as a whole. And he makes the claim that essentially what this really says is that it's not a solid picture that we have of the Scottish economy through GERS. So my question is, as we contemplate the impact of Brexit or not on Scotland and these bespoke deals, what role will GERS figures or should GERS figures play as we try to understand that? Thanks,
Steve. You're right. I mean, any set of accounts which are partly shadow accounts, as GERS are, which impute certain levels of spending across Scotland, some of which is reserve spending, is, it leads you into territory which is quite complicated. So in terms of, if you're trying to evaluate the impact of a bespoke deal, I showed the figures for the WTO case for Scotland. And it's really interesting because if you were trying to implement Scotland's place in Europe, there would actually be a relative impact on the UK and Scotland because the UK under the differentiated deal would not be in the single market, the rest of the UK, Scotland would be. It would create some movement in economic activity between the rest of the UK and Scotland. For instance, if we have financial passporting in Scotland, but the rest of the UK doesn't, you might find some city firms setting up in Scotland. So these are dynamic effects that, no static set of figures. If I asked Gary and his team and Scottish Government saying, use your NIGEM Scottish Government GEM model to model all this, it's actually difficult because it's a change in the structure of the Scottish economy and the UK economy. So these are difficult to model. You're absolutely right. And you would need to make assumptions about how much economic activity would, say, move to Scotland because of the differentiated effects. Now, some of them might move from the rest of the UK, but some of it might come from elsewhere in Europe. It's really complicated. And that's why, I would just urge you to, I've presented you the evidence as it is, but I'm not pretending that these calculations are precise. They have error bands, of course, but the key message is that any sort of hard Brexit is costly. Any sort of solution that places us within the single market as opposed to outside is likely to help to alleviate that. How much? Difficult to say. If I had to do an economic evaluation of Scotland's place in Europe, you need to start making assumptions of how many jobs would move around to Scotland from elsewhere in the single market, from our UK. These are difficult issues. And another big assumption you need to make is what would happen to non-tariff barriers in terms of customs controls and things because although we would be in the single market, we would not be in the customs union. What other free trade deals would we do? It's a very complicated picture. And so, caveats are there. But, I hope to have shown you at least this, that membership in the single market, a softer Brexit is better than a harder Brexit. That's all we can say, I think. Yes, question here and then one there.
Thank you for this comprehensive and impressive presentation. The First Minister always talking about independence of Scotland. What do you think the consequences of independence of Scotland to UK, Scotland, and EU? Is it better to Scotland to avoid the risks of Brexit or not? I know we need like a presentation or maybe hours to talk about this one, but just like general, briefly, what do you think about the independence of Scotland?
I somehow thought that question was going to come up. So let me just tell you a bit of a preamble. I think this is important. In 2014, this university, all universities in Scotland, many institutions, because we are charities, was neutral in the constitutional debate. We had to be. For reasons that we are charities, but also for a very good reason that if I looked around at this university, we were probably as divided as the country was in terms of opinion. So that's a starting point. We took the view that we would, of course, as individual academics, want to contribute to that debate, and indeed all of our academics on different sides of the debate contributed actively to that. Now, my position is a bit more difficult than that because as head of an institution that was nominally neutral through that debate, it's very difficult for me to take a position that's visible. So the line I took is that I was very happy to give some commentary on particular issues, and some of you will possibly remember that I did comment on one or two issues, but it's difficult for me to take a position on the overall question. Can I just say one thing about the approach, if you want to answer that question for yourself, the approach you should take, however? I think one of the things that's really important, and that's one of the lessons even from the Brexit figures I showed you, is you need to look at the long term. You cannot make these sorts of discussions about constitutional change based on 1 or 2 years ahead. That's a crazy way to think. Constitutional change is about forevermore. So you need to think about that. The other thing you need to think about, which is really, really important, is that, again, if you look at history and what it teaches us about constitutional change, it tells us that it's really about nations either staying together or being created around a set of values, principles. That's what often the debate's about. Actually, I think it was John Kay who, during the debate on the 2014 independence referendum, said, he said he despaired as an economist that so much was being put on the economic arguments, when in fact, with a lot of these arguments, it's about the long term. So that's all I would say to you. I would say answer that question by yourself, but look at your own perspective of the long term. I think these are the key issues when it comes to constitutional issues, not short term. In the same way as we have to confront in terms of Brexit, not just what the short term consequences are. If this was about 2-3 years of negative economic consequences, we could all say, well, that's not great, but we'll just swallow hard and cope with it. This is about an impact over the longer term. That's what it's about. There's a question here, and there was 2 questions there as well. I think if you bring the microphone here, we can take 2 or 3 questions.
Hi there, I'm a student at Glasgow University and I'm a EU national, and I've spent the last 12 years living in this country. So obviously I've set my life here, and obviously the result was heartbreaking on the day. And since then there has been no reassurance for EU citizens of any sort, with an exception of Scotland's position that they will protect and everything. My question is, what is your prediction of what is going to happen to members of the EU living in the UK, and whether there will be a division between Scotland and the rest of the UK when the Brexit comes into place?
So on a question of what will happen, I do think the UK will have to confront this basic issue that it wants to take control of immigration, but as I hope I've shown, economically, we actually need the skills of the many EU citizens and indeed non-EU citizens that have come here. I forget what the statistics are for the NHS, but I mean, it's a staggering figure of EU nationals that work for the NHS. And there's absolutely no way in which we could replace that workforce from EU nationals, from UK nationals in the short term. So part of me thinks rationality will kick in at some point. And during this process, we will have to recognize actually that although we might want control, actually at the end of the day, we have a large number of people working in this country are contributing very actively. I even got into an interesting discussion with a UK government official at one point who said, you know, taking control is not necessarily the same thing as exercising control. At which point I thought I was in Alice in Wonderland, but there's a message in there which is really saying, well, actually, economic reality will kick in and we'll realize that, but we're doing damage because, as you say, you've been unsettled by it, I've been unsettled by it, and I'm a dual citizen. So I do think that they will need to resolve this. I do think they've got a problem, though, because by they, I mean the Home Office, in terms of trying to develop a new immigration system for EU citizens, because they can't just roll across the Tier 2 system that applies to non-EU citizens across the EU citizens, because, you know, that data, the data on, we don't have a population register in the UK, we don't have a residency register. If you want to prove, as you probably know, if you have to prove that you've been resident here for 4 or 5 years, you have to provide evidence yourself. It's going to be years and years, I think, for them to sort this out. And I think personally, if I had to make a prediction, and economists are notably bad at predictions, I think they will have to basically say, you know what, everybody who's here, we're going to effectively having to wipe the slate clean. And I think they should have done that already, as I said, but that's my prediction. I don't think they can take any other way forward. It would be too economically damaging, and it would be too difficult from the point of view of the administrative arrangements. So fingers crossed. But it's not a very gracious way of doing it, and that's all I would say. Yes.
Oh, hello. Oh.
Sorry. Sorry. Hello. Yes.
Sorry.
And then we'll bring it here.
My name's Sarah Currier. I'm a staff member at University of Glasgow, a non-EU immigrant, and cried as much the day after the vote as I did in September 2014, even though it doesn't affect me personally. Anyway, you did put it up on your slide, and I'm almost scared to ask, and you're not an expert in this area, but what do you mean by dramatic political events within the EU? And the last bullet point.
All right. Well, I mean,
Some examples.
That was, well, the examples, I mean, I suppose it's less likely now, but I thought at the time when I was writing some of this, I thought a Le Pen victory might be a possibility, a Wilders victory. I mean, we know the Dutch elections have now happened. I don't think the German elections will create an anti-establishment, anti-EU sentiment, so all that's left is France. That's all I can think of at the moment, and there may be other issues that I'm less aware of. As I say, I'm not a political scientist, but that's what I was thinking about, essentially. I think we have one question. here, and then perhaps we can take one more after that, and then we probably should stop. Hello.
Thank you very much. Vanessa Glynn from the European Movement Scotland. Thank you for a very excellent and clear analysis of the situation we're in. I have one clarification I'd like to ask you as an economic expert. Could you explain whether economic gravity or trade gravity also applies to services, or is it really only a question of things that have to be physically transported? And also, following on from the possibility of future political change within the EU, and I share your analysis that that is very happily looking less likely. Economic future for the EU 27, issues facing the Eurozone, what should the EU be thinking about doing economically to strengthen itself in the coming 10 to 20 years? Thank you.
Thank you for those quick questions. The answer to the first question is yes, but gravity effects are less important for services. And I don't have, I'm afraid, the statistics to hand, but from what I've seen, there are smaller gravity effects for services than there are for goods. Coming to your second question, yeah, I mean, the Eurozone is a difficulty. I mean, and we've written about it. It's, in a sense, it's in a bit of suspended animation. I mean, frankly, there is a huge political dispute that has to be resolved here. The the Eurozone countries have to confront this issue of how to deal with a situation in which a small group of countries, mainly Germany, has persistent current account and budget surpluses, and you have another part of the Eurozone that has persistent current account deficits. The only way to solve that, ultimately, is through internal transfers, to create a tighter fiscal union within those countries. It doesn't have to be a complete fiscal union. You don't have to have a complete fiscal union with monetary union, but you do need some element of fiscal transfers, because there is no doubt, and I know the Italian situation pretty well, that since the entry to the euro, the Italian economy has lost more and more of its competitiveness. It hasn't made those structural reforms. They're probably politically too difficult to make, certainly in the short run, and so there is no other solution. I have to say it's an irony in a sense, because if I think the UK hadn't called for a referendum, I actually think, you know, some people were beginning to talk about a future of Europe in 20, 30 years' time, where you had a much tighter inner core in around the Eurozone that was looking for greater political integration and greater fiscal union, an outer core, including the Nordic countries, Sweden's, Norway's, which are within the European single market, perhaps even countries like Ukraine, Georgia, etc., coming into that sphere. And all this has been blown open because with Brexit, of course, all the attitudes have hardened. There is no willingness to talk about. And of course, now we know that from the latest sort of summit of some of the major EU countries, they're talking about variable speeds. It's a difficult discussion. The Visegrad countries are saying, no, we don't want multiple speed Europe. But I think those are debates that will be held. I think, unfortunately, I think Brexit actually has hit the pause button on all these important discussions, including potential Eurozone reform, including potential for outer cores which are in the single market, but some in the EU, some outside the EU, and so on. And we'll need to see how the EU architecture evolves in 30 years' time, but I do think Brexit, if anything, has hit a pause button on all that. One last question. Yes, I think Mary, over here.
Thanks. I maybe missed it among your analysis, Anton, but I'd be keen to know your perspective on the movement of the pound as part of this, because currency, you know, a lot of the more, what do we call them, staunch Brexiteers talk about how, you know, very casually and without presenting the evidence about how the recent currency movements more than offset some of the negative impacts that we'd thought were going to come about, especially in trade. And I know that currency, you know, devalue, if the pound falls, okay, it makes exporting easier, but it makes the import of raw materials more expensive, relatively speaking. So I would just be interested in your thoughts about the movements of the UK currency.
Thanks for that question, Mary, because I skipped over that bit of the lecture, and now I've remembered I skipped over it. I actually was going to mention the depreciation because it's my sort of vindication for my view of the world as opposed to economists for Brexit. Because if financial markets believed economists for Brexit, then actually the pound should have appreciated after Brexit. But it didn't. It depreciated because markets were convinced, my interpretation, markets were convinced that essentially the UK's competitive position would deteriorate, and as a result, the long-term value of the pound had to decline in order to allow for that. What is the impact? In the short run, of course, as you say, it's will push up import prices. It will erode some of that consumer confidence because most of us are finding that it's affecting our purchasing power of our salaries. And I think in the short term, certainly salaries will probably not keep up. So after 2 or 3 years, in which we've finally seen some upswing in real incomes, we'll find real incomes declining. So that will have a negative impact on the economy. But you're right, it also, one of the really interesting things will be, is this it? Or what will happen next? Because I don't think financial markets really know the exact impact of Brexit, no more than we can know it. You know, there are a variety of possible scenarios, cliff edge. If news transpires over the next couple of years that we're heading towards a cliff edge, I would confidently predict at that point you'll get even more of a depreciation because inevitably it will hit us harder than the rest of the EU. So, and that will have, again, consequential, that'll be how some of the erosion in consumption will come. It'll come through increased import prices and consumer prices. That's implicit in some of the figures, absolutely, because the structural models, the global econometric model that the National Institute uses, the Scottish Government uses, basically imposes a shock on the model around trade, around migration, and this winds its way through a standard macroeconomic model. So the exchange rate is part of that. The exchange rate would depreciate, and that will feed through to consumer spending. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I say that the number of people who turned out tonight, and even more so the number of people who wanted to come along tonight and we weren't able to accommodate, is testimony both to the importance of the Brexit issue and the considerations of that in Scotland, but also to the fact that we were very fortunate in the university to have Scotland's leading economist to actually provide us with that kind of overview. We've had a very compendious analysis. I'm sure that the elements of that are going to be poured over for 2 years and more to come. And I think, as Anton has pointed out, the implications of what's been talked about here are long-term, not short-term. So we can all focus on the immediate issues, but there are a whole series of long-term issues about the country's future, both Scotland and the UK, that need to be looked at. So on your behalf, can I thank Anton very much for his lecture. Thank Anne Anderson, our head of college, for providing the introduction. And thank you for coming along tonight to listen to it. And I hope that you will come along to future events, because we're certainly hoping to provide you with as much quality information and as many voices that have an authoritative view to put forward over the next 18 months to 2 years. So thank you very much for coming along. Safe home.